Hey everyone, Nathan Warner here from Blabberdock Art Studio, and I'm kind of doing an interview with myself with some questions that people have asked me over the years. I was recently at Starfest in Denver, Colorado, and I did some panels on my art for the Klingon assault group there, House Vampire. And that was a great experience. I got to talk with some people about my process, about my art, answer some questions, talk to some creators, some 3D animators, and some artists, and share my thoughts on it. And since then, I've developed a lot of new art and a lot of different directions, and I wanted to share some of my thinking process on what kind of art I do, where my inspirations come from, what is art kind of in a general sense, and where am I fitting in on that. So we'll see how this goes. So first of all, answering the question, what kind of art do you do? Well, it's a scale. It's a broad scale is the way that I think of it. And I'm not a professionally trained artist, so professionally trained artists may have a different vocabulary for this. But the way that I think of it is there's a scale, and on the left-hand side of the scale, that far side, that extreme, you have like landscape paintings, right? And landscape paintings are where a painter is not introducing anything new into the art. They are entirely focused on recording reality, what they are seeing. They're not adding anything new into that. And so that's one extreme, right? And then on the right hand side, the other side of the extreme, you have like pure fantasy, where there's nothing familiar in the artwork at all. It's all just crazy out there stuff. Probably super abstract, maybe too. I don't know. And that might be a different scale. So on the one hand, art that represents reality completely. And then on the other hand, art that is completely fantasy, no reality in it. And so you think about the landscape painter, and maybe they're painting a scene and they're like, you know what? There is no windmill in this scene, but it'd be really cool if there was. What if I painted a windmill right there? Or what if, those square bales, my grandfather was a painter, and he would paint mountain scenes and things like that on the West Coast. And there was this particular painting we still have to this day where he has these nice bundles of hay out in a field, and there are deer. And in reality, it was square bales and they were sheep. So he altered reality for the sake of the art. And so you have landscape painters who start adding fantasy elements, I would call them. Now they can still be grounded in reality, like, deer are not fantasy elements, but you're changing the reality of what you're seeing. You're no longer purely painting reality. You're no longer purely depicting reality. You're adding a fantastic element into it, something that doesn't exist there. And that's where we start to get into some the idea of concept art, because concept artists are often trying to take a fantasy idea that does not exist, and they're trying to show it in an environment that is familiar to us, maybe, to ground this fictional fantasy idea, to ground it into reality by showing it as if it's existing in something that is familiar to us. And I have a variety of art pieces like that. I have a recent one that I did was called The Visitor, and it's a Danube class runabout shuttle kind of floating over an alpine forest in a snowstorm, a sleet storm, something like that. And that was a real image of an alpine forest that I took. So it's reality. The Danube class shuttlecraft, the model is real, but the actual thing doesn't exist. And so I'm trying to conceptualize what a Danube class shuttlecraft would look like if it was floating over a forest, but artistically, not photorealistically, because if you zoom in on it, there's canvas textures. It looks like a painting, right? So it's art. but it's conceptual art. It's trying to bring the unreal to life in a way that's grounded. And I've done a lot of that. I think a lot of my early art I would describe as kind of these concept art landscapes or portraits that way, where it's the idea of what would a galaxy class saucer look like thundering over a forest? What would a galaxy class saucer look like landed in a forest? What would it look like? These ideas that have been in my head all these years that have fascinated me and inspired me. Now it's how do I conceptualize that? I have the tools now. I want to show that. So it's kind of concept art. So it's mixing a little bit of fantasy into reality. So a lot of my early art is that way. I've got a Nova class starship landing on a planet, and it's actually a photo of Montana that I took while I was in geology camp. I have the Defiant class flying around an atmosphere, in situations in atmosphere that are real photos. I took those photos out of airplane windows oftentimes. Things like that. So it's concept art. And a lot of my early art was that. They were trying to ground the majesty of Star Trek into something we know and we understand to make it more believable, but also inspiring. Like, wow, that would be amazing to see that, to be there, to feel the heat as that ship thunders over my head, or to hear that sonic boom as that Defiant class starship roars past through the atmosphere. So that was pretty much my main focus, or approach to the art. It was concept. I want to do concepts. As well as, I think another driving force, which is tangential along the side of this, is there's kind of an attitude today that the next generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, those are worn out. Those ships and those ideas, it's all worn out, and we need to reboot, and we need to make it more actionist, more like Star Wars. I like Star Wars too. I'm not knocking Star Wars, but Star Trek is not Star Wars. And so with my art, in a sense, I'm rebelling against that notion that these are worn out, trite, boring things that need to be rebooted. And I'm showing, no, there's still wonder here. There's still majesty. There's still incredible visions to be explored and stories. And that's why my art inspires the stories that I write. I've written a lot of short Star Trek stories that go with my art. And that is kind of part of raging against this idea that these are boring, trite, worn out ideas that we need to throw away and we need to reboot everything, which has been Star Trek for the last, couple decades, I think now. It's the idea that we need to just restart it, go back in time, and do something different, totally change it. And I rebel against that because there's so much wonder in my imagination with these old designs, with the Defiant class and the Galaxy class and the Bird of Prey and, the Vorcha class, all of these old, incredibly amazing ships that we're just going to throw away because they're old. And it feels like a betrayal to me, kind of. It's like, that's not right. It's not right to do that. There's so much wonder still here. We can change the way we tell stories, which is what I do, right? Very few of my stories follow a crew around all the time. They're usually jumping around from ship to ship, crew to crew, different situation, different times even, and exploring, creating kind of a collage tapestry of the unsung heroes in Star Trek. Stories we never heard about, things that happened that were amazing, incredible, and weird, to ships and crews that we've never heard about, right? And we're kind of jumping around episode to episode to different crews and different ships, and I'm trying to get you interested and invested in this person and this ship and this crew in a very short amount of time. And I think that for a lot of my fans, I've accomplished that. So that's part of the art too, is trying to say, no, these are not worn out, boring, trite ideas that need to be disposed of. There's still wonder here. And so that was part of it too. So concept art was a big part of a lot of my early art. By the time I went to Starfest in Colorado, I was kind of feeling burned out. I had done a lot of terrestrial scenes, a lot of ships and atmosphere and landing, and I didn't know what else I could do with that. I didn't want to get stuck in, I'm just going to basically retell the same exact visual story but with different ships. Like, oh, here's this ship landing, oh, here's this ship landing, oh, here's this ship landing, and it's like the same exact thing over and over. I wanted to break into new territory, but I didn't know where to go. I almost felt like maybe I'm done, maybe there's nothing more to say. I don't know. And my brother kept pushing me, kept asking me the simple question, why don't you do more space scenes? And I kept telling him, because space, it's very difficult to do anything creative in space, because space is a vacuum. How do you create the sense of depth and perspective and atmosphere and motion and so forth in space? It's just hard. And the fact that there's very little art out there that I think accomplishes that is showing that. It's proving that point. A lot of space art is kind of boring. It's like a generic background, and there's the ship, and it's a generic background, right? Now, there's exceptions. There's great art out there, obviously. I think I missed in talking about what part of my inspiration too, and I'll get to this subconsciously. I'll get to these inspirations in a minute as well, what inspires me. But part of the inspiration in all of my art too is aviation art. As a kid, I loved aviation art. I loved those beautiful paintings of BF-109 Messerschmitts, P-51 Mustangs and P-38 Lightnings flying through the clouds with this great sense of perspective. Here's the ship, there's the aircraft here, and then there are aircraft way down there, far away, and then there's clouds, and then there's like farm fields way down there. There's a great sense of depth and perspective and atmosphere and color and motion, a sense of motion and energy and life. And I love that with aviation art. I don't own any aviation art. It's all from my childhood. I would love it. I had my dad buy me a book about the Battle of Britain purely for the art that was on it. So it really made an impression on me as a child. And so I think you can see that in a lot of my art. Think of, what's the piece? The Art of War, with the two birds of prey thundering overhead in the atmosphere. That piece of art, that is inspired subconsciously, I realize, probably from some piece of art in the past where there was, I don't know if it was Spitfires probably, thundering overhead on their way to patrol the English coast during the Battle of Britain. So there's a lot of my art is subconsciously inspired by the energy and the perspective and depth and atmosphere of aviation art. And you can probably see that if you look at it, especially my older stuff. So that brings us up to, as I was saying, Starfest in Colorado. And, what am I going to do now? And my brother's saying, space, try that. And I kept telling him, it's really hard. But I finally said, you know what? Boundaries. I believe in boundaries as an artist. You need boundaries because you run up against a boundary, and a boundary pushes your creativity. You're like, how am I going to, with this restraint, how am I going to get my idea across? And that really pushes you in different directions you wouldn't normally go, which is another reason I think 3D animation can be a real problem, because in 3D animation, you can kind of show anything at all. There are no boundaries, so to speak, in the same sense as traditional special effects. You had real boundaries because you had to make physical models, and how much can you get in the camera, and how can you move it, how can you move the camera, and so you had to come up with really creative solutions to those boundaries that you'd run into. So there I am, I'm thinking about it, and I go, you know what, I'm going to take this on. This is a boundary. This is something, a challenge. I'm going to take this on. And the first piece that I made, I took an old image of a Saber-class starship that I had, and I threw it into this unused scene I never used of a planet, clouds in the below the ship, and I just started creating this space scene. So the ship is straddling the terrestrial environment and the infinity of space, and I created this piece I called Tripping the Light Fantastic. And at the time, it blew my mind. It was like, wow, this is really cool. I could get into this. I think I can do this. I can do space scenes. And I kind of see that piece as the birth of the new mode that I went into after that. Because it was like 1 foot in the terrestrial, because the ship was in orbit. Down below, you could see the clouds, and it was the familiar terrestrial environment. And then above, it was like weird aurora borealis, an artificial created moon by some alien race, and then this majestic galaxy in the far distance. And I created that sense of depth. I created a sense of perspective and wonder and awe and motion. And so I thought, I can do this. And so that's what began my massive leap that I've been doing into this other form of art, which I would argue is more fantasy. Remember I was talking about landscapes and how it's mostly real, and you're just introducing one small fantasy element into it, like a lighthouse that isn't there. And in my case, it'd be a starship that actually wasn't there in Montana, right? Or in that landscape. Now I'm moving on. I moved on into almost pure fantasy, where the only familiar thing is the ship, which doesn't exist, but it's familiar to people of the show, right? So it's much more fantasy driven. It's not real, and it's a pure exploration of just wonder. So no longer is it concept art. I'm not doing concept art like, what would it look like? Because if you were to do like concept art for space, like what would it look like if a ship was in space? It would be rather boring. It would be mostly black most of the time, dark space. So the new art is just pure fantasy, and it's purely trying to get across a feeling, an emotion, a sense of awe and inspiration, like, whoa, to where you're not just focused on the ship. A lot of 3D animators are doing ship art. Like the primary focus is the ship in the scene. But I want my viewers to be just as interested by the backgrounds as the ship that's in the foreground. Like, whoa, what is going on? That would be so cool to explore that region beyond. So that's where the art kind of went. It went towards pure fantasy. And that's kind of where I am right now. I know that I just mentioned the piece, The Visitor, with the new shuttlecraft flying over the woods, and I've done a couple more terrestrial pieces like that. So I'm kind of putting the brakes on a little bit on my fantasy stuff and like, whoa, let's try some terrestrial stuff too. Let's try some different things. I'm not stuck in any mode. I wanna try getting some different emotions, some different feelings, whether it's suspense, mystery, inspiration, wonder, whatever. So that's kind of where I'm at now. That's the process. That's kind of the scale of my art as I see it. And you can kind of put all my art pieces on that scale and see where they all fit on that sliding scale of art. But then, so I wanted to talk a little bit about inspiration. What inspires you? I've gotten that question a number of times. Like, where do you get your inspiration from? Right? And I would say there are 3 main places that I've been able to pinpoint. And I've already kind of mentioned a couple of these. But one region was concept art. I loved concept art as a kid. I loved like the books, The Art of Star Trek or The Art of Star Wars. How these artists grappled with showing these incredibly amazing places that don't actually exist, right? How did they do that? And so they're visualizing these either entirely fantastical things with nothing grounding in it. Or, for example, like with newer Star Wars renditions like The Force Awakens, where I bought the art of The Force Awakens. That book was amazing. And, they have the Millennium Falcon in a lot of different situations that we've never seen it in. Then the artists are doing that. And that's kind of more the concept art I do, because it's sticking with something that we all know. It's not a new ship. It's not a new design. I don't do that. I do old legacy type ships. So I do the Galaxy and the Defiant and the Nova class and the Prometheus and these things that we know. We may not know super well, but we know of them. And I'm putting them into new environments. So some of the concept art that I do is a lot like that. It's like, oh, there's the Millennium Falcon, and it's like floating up to this, cliff, and someone's jumping off of it. Someone's gotten off and they're walking and jumping off of it onto the cliff from the Millennium Falcon. So it's that kind of concept art. So I love concept art. I could just look at a concept art book all day. I love it. It's amazing. So that has been a inspiration to me, obviously. I've already mentioned aviation art, and I think subconsciously I've drawn a lot on aviation art. There's just so much there. So much beauty and wonder. It's a world that a lot of us, we don't live in it. And so that's akin to space, right? We don't live in space. We live on hard ground, terra firma. And aviation art kind of gets you out of that. You're in the heavens. You're flying through the clouds. And there's this adventure and wonder up there and conflict. And all kinds of amazing things are happening. So aviation art certainly has been an inspiration subconsciously. Like, I don't go to my art. I don't go to do art and go, oh, I'm going to make a piece. I'm going to model it off of that piece of aviation art that I have on the wall over there. No, I don't have any art in my house to speak of. I don't look at other people's art and go, I'm going to make a Star Trek version of that. I don't do any of that. It was all subconscious. It was in my memory, my subconscious memory from my childhood, the things that really affected me and that I loved. And aviation art and concept art were two of those things. And I hadn't really realized until, like I said, this new phase of this more fantasy art that I've been doing, this mystical, almost spiritual art of ships in these really beautiful space cathedral type environments. I hadn't really realized until I'd done quite a few that I was being influenced by, I'd always liked fantasy art as a child. I don't know what to call it. Fantasy art, mystical art. I have a hard time pinning it down. But one artist that has always stuck in my memory is Christian Lassen, I believe is his name, and he does underwater scenes. But he does them in a fantasy way. So he'll have humpback whales and killer whales and dolphins, but it's always a magical and kind of mystical environment. And I loved his art as a child because I'd gotten a school binder, a folder with his art on it. I'd gotten a couple for my school. And I used to love just sitting there and looking at it. This magical world. Again, a world that we don't live in, underwater. We can kind of visit it, but we can't live underwater. And this magical, mystical kind of environment, fantasy. And he would add fantasy into it. If you know his work, he often did kind of half and half, where it'd be half of it was underwater and half of it was above water. But what he would do is he would bring like a galaxy in and blow it up in the sky. Or the moon would be larger than life, or there would be planets, big planets. And I love that kind of art where it's fantastical, it's mystical, it's kind of spiritual almost. You get kind of a sense of it's taking you outside of yourself. And I didn't really realize that, but that was kind of influencing my new mode of art, where I've been exploring these kind of fantastical environments in space with these ships, getting out there, seeing these amazing, crazy things. So I hope that has been this kind of dump from my mind of what inspires me. Why do I do the kind of art that I do? The bottom line is I'm trying to get across the wonder and majesty and adventure and inspiration and awe that Star Trek gave me as a child. It was one of the first creative works. I think it was that and the Chronicles of Narnia. And so I have a deep love for classical fantasy like Chronicles of Narnia and The Lord of the Rings. Those two are huge elements in my life. I haven't done much art in that side of things, but huge influence on my life. And then on the other side, it was Star Trek and Star Wars. And it all kind of happened at the same time. And so deeply affected by these things. And Star Trek deeply affected me. You know, there was nothing greater than the idea of out there on the frontier. And when my dad would be working on our fence, building a fence or whatever, and I'd be out helping him. Oh man, I was on, Cessna's 5 away team, and we were doing a survey mission. And when he wasn't looking, I'd be pretending to use a tricorder and scanning the fence post like it was some kind of transporter inhibitor or something, and that was my life. It was integrated into my daily life in such a way. When I'd go to bed at night, we'd have this air cleaner in the bedroom, and there would be a soft blue glow from the yard light outside that would come through the window, so the room was kind of softly lit up like moonlight. There'd be this soft humming, and it sounded like a starship. And so I'd go to bed every night as if I was the captain of my starship, and it was kind of in my head, it was like a Nova class starship. I didn't know about the Nova class at that time. And I had a picture of it from the Galaxy class technical manual that I had photocopied, and I had it in a frame in my bed. That was my ship. I'd go to sleep at night, and I'd be doing my captain's log in my head, and I'd be thinking about where we were going, and outside the stars were warping by the window, and I was safe. I was in my starship. This thing has shields and weapons, and I'm safe. This is my ship, and I can go anywhere with it. I can go anywhere in the universe. Well, within limits, right? Knowing the physics of the Star Trek universe. But it's kind of like in fantasy, the horse or the magical beast that you can ride. It can take you anywhere. It's freeing. It frees you out of your pedantic life or your boring life or whatever. And so Shadowfax in The Lord of the Rings, the fastest horse that ever was. You could run away from all dangers. You could run into combat on Shadowfax, and he'd carry you through it. And he was fast, and you could go anywhere with him. And it's kind of that idea for me. I realized in my art, starships are that for me. They're my Shadowfax. They're the thing that I ride, the safe thing that can take me away from danger and carry me through danger, through battles, and protect me, so to speak, and take me into these wonderful, magical places where I can see things I've never seen before. And that's sort of, again, what I'm trying to show in my art, is recapturing that sense from my childhood, that wonder, that awe that was Star Trek. So I hope you enjoyed that, and look forward to talking to you again about art. And if you guys have any questions, please leave comments. I would love to answer any questions that you have. Again, this is Nathan Warner, artist at Blabberdock Studio Creations. You can check out my gallery at www.blabberdock.com, and from there you can find this YouTube channel. You can find my gallery, obviously, my blog where I tell my stories, my Patreon page. Please consider supporting me on Patreon or purchasing some of my art on my gallery. I do have a DeviantArt page. I'm trying to think. I feel like I'm missing something. But anyways, go to my website. Check it out. Till next time, make it so.